Told them I applied to Stanford. Dad spit his wine. Your community college material. Sister smirked. At Dad's gala, a Fedex arrived. Mom opened it and literally collapsed. My name is Riley, and for the first 18 years of my life, I was a ghost haunting a museum of someone else's achievements. We lived in a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of an architectural magazine in the North Shore of Chicago. It was all cold marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and furniture that was far too expensive to actually sit on. To the outside world, the Harrison family was the American dream personified. My father, Harrison, was the CEO of a top-tier marketing agency, a man who measured his worth by the thread count of his suits and the prestige of his golf club membership. My mother, Caroline, was the ultimate gatekeeper of our public image, a woman who treated neighborhood optics like a high-stakes war zone. Then there was Madison, my older sister, the golden child. Madison was a pageant winner, a varsity cheerleader, and the sun that the entire Harrison universe revolved around. She had my mother's polished smile and my father's desperate need for validation. And me? I was the background noise. I was the drab gray paint on the wall that existed only to make Madison's blonde highlights pop. In our house, love wasn't something you felt, it was something you earned through a points system that only my father controlled. He didn't treat us like a family. He treated us like a corporate hierarchy where he was the undisputed chairman, Madison was the star vice president, and I was the intern who was constantly on the verge of being fired. I learned very early on that taking up space was a punishable offense. If I tried to share a small win, I was told I was being arrogant. If I asked for help, I was told I was being needy. Eventually, I just stopped talking. I realized that if I remained invisible, I remained safe. I watched from the shadows as my parents poured every ounce of their emotional and financial resources into Madison, while I was left to navigate the world on my own. I wasn't just the second child, I was the backup plan that nobody ever intended to use. The disparity in our house wasn't just emotional, it was documented in bank statements. When Madison turned 17, she brought home a report card that was mostly C- grades. She threw a fit in the kitchen, crying that the teachers were out to get her and that the stress was ruining her mental health. The very next day, my father bought her a brand new SUV worth $40,000. He said she needed a confidence boost to remind her how special she was. Meanwhile, I was working double shifts at a greasy local diner 3 miles away. I spent my weekends scrubbing industrial-sized stoves and mopping up spilled soda while the North Shore elite looked right through me. I worked those shifts because I knew my parents would never fund my future. They happily paid $500 a month for Madison's hair extensions, but when I asked for a new computer for school, my father told me to learn the value of $1 and get a job. So I did. I smelled like old frying oil and industrial-strength bleach every single night. My hands were cracked and red from the chemicals, but I saved every single dime. I remember the night I brought home a perfect score on the statewide standardized test, a score that put me in the top 0.1% of the country. I left the results on the kitchen island, my heart pounding, hoping that maybe, just this once, my father would say he was proud. Instead, my mother walked into the kitchen, picked up the paper without even reading it, and tossed it into the recycling bin. She told me that clutter on the granite countertops gives me a migraine and reminded me that nobody likes a show-off. That was the moment I realized that my achievements were actually an insult to them. My success threatened the narrative that Madison was the smart one. From then on, I kept my grades to myself. I kept my money in a private account they couldn't touch. I was a millionaire in potential, living like a pauper in a mansion. My bedroom was the only place where I truly existed. While the rest of the family was downstairs watching movies or hosting lavish dinner parties, I was locked away in my own world. I eventually saved up enough from the diner to buy a refurbished laptop. It was clunky, the battery lasted about 20 minutes, and the fan sounded like a jet engine, but to me, it was a gateway to freedom. I taught myself how to code. I started with basic HTML and moved on to Python and complex data modeling. I found a strange, beautiful peace in the world of logic. In my house, the rules were a moving target. What was okay today would get me grounded tomorrow, depending on Madison's mood or my father's stress levels. But in code, a semicolon was always a semicolon. If the program failed, it was because of a logical error I could fix, not because the computer simply preferred my sister. I became obsessed with predictive analytics. I started building small models using open-source datasets, analyzing everything from local real estate trends to retail fluctuations. I realized I was good at it. Really good. While my mother was obsessing over the color of the napkins for her next brunch, I was building algorithms that could predict market shifts with startling accuracy. I knew then that Stanford was my only way out. I wanted to be in Palo Alto, surrounded by people who cared about intellect rather than country club status. I applied in total secrecy. I used the diner's mailing address for all correspondence. I was living a double life, a submissive, quiet daughter by day and a budding data scientist by night. By the time I was a senior in high school, a new player had entered the game. Madison started dating Carter. Carter was the human equivalent of a participation trophy, wealthy, arrogant, and possessing the intellectual depth of a puddle. His family owned a string of luxury car dealerships, and my father treated him like royalty because of the potential business connections. Every Sunday dinner became a nightmare. I was expected to set the table, clear the plates, and essentially act as the help while they sat around drinking expensive wine and talking about their upcoming vacations to Aspen or St. Tropez. Carter loved to hear himself talk. He would spend hours lecturing the table on entrepreneurship, which usually just meant he had used his father's credit card to buy something expensive. He would look at me in my diner uniform and smirk, making little comments about how some people are just born to serve. Madison would lean into him, acting like she was a corporate mogul in the making, despite the fact that she was currently failing her freshman year at a private college downtown. They were a perfect match of vanity and entitlement. I would sit there, silently clearing their steak bones, and think about the predictive models I had running on my laptop upstairs. I was counting down the days. I just needed to survive until the early action decisions came out. I thought if I stayed quiet enough, I could just slip away into the night, and they would never have to think about me again. I was wrong. I grossly underestimated just how much they felt entitled to my life. It was a Tuesday night in late October when the facade finally cracked. My father sent a text to the family group chat that read, "Mandatory family meeting. Dining room. 7 o'clock sharp." In my house, that was the equivalent of being summoned to the principal's office. When I walked downstairs, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperation. My father was at the head of the mahogany table, looking like he was about to fire an entire department. My mother was nervously twisting her diamond ring. Madison was there, too, but she wasn't her usual smug self. She was crying real, messy tears that were ruining her makeup. Carter was sitting next to her, rubbing her shoulder with a look of performative concern. I sat down, keeping my hands folded in my lap. My father didn't waste time. He explained that Madison was going through a difficult transition. Translation: she had been kicked out of her university. But it wasn't just about the grades. It turned out Madison had accidentally spent her entire semester's tuition on a week-long luxury shopping spree and a 5-star retreat in Cabo with Carter. She had essentially embezzled her own education fund, and the university had sent a final notice of non-payment along with her academic dismissal. Any other parent would have lost their mind, but Harrison and Caroline were too busy trying to figure out how to cover it up so the neighbors wouldn't find out. "We are pulling Madison out of that toxic environment immediately," my father announced, as if the university was the problem and not his daughter's theft. "She will take a gap semester to focus on her mental health and plan her wedding to Carter." Then he turned his cold, calculating gaze toward me. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "However, this creates a liquidity issue for the family. We have to pay the university the outstanding balance to release her transcripts, and weddings are not cheap. We are a family, Riley. And families make sacrifices for one another." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew exactly where this was going. He told me that they could no longer afford to finance my college applications or tuition for next year. He said I was to withdraw my early action applications immediately. I was to enroll in the local community college, which was basically free, and move back into my childhood bedroom. But here was the kicker. He demanded that I transfer the $10,000 I had saved from the diner into Madison's account to help cover her debts. It's the right thing to do, my mother chimed in, not even looking at me. Your sister is in a crisis, Riley. You've always been so self-sufficient. You don't need a fancy school to succeed, but Madison needs this wedding to get her life back on track. I sat there, looking at the people who were supposed to protect me. They were casually asking me to set my entire future on fire to keep Madison warm. They wanted the money I had earned through sweat and humiliation to pay for her Cabo vacation. For 18 years, I had shrunk myself to fit their mold. But in that moment, something inside me finally snapped. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it hit the room like a bomb. My father blinked, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. Excuse me? I am not giving Madison a single penny of my savings, I said, my voice growing stronger. I earned that money. She spent hers on vacations. That's her problem. And I am absolutely not withdrawing my applications. I am going to a 4-year university. My father didn't yell at first. He laughed. It was a cruel, condescending sound that made my skin crawl. He reached for his wine glass, took a sip, and then actually spit some of it back out as he wheezed with amusement. Stanford? You applied to Stanford. He looked at my mother, and then at Carter. That is rich, Riley. That is the funniest thing I've heard all week. He leaned in closer, his eyes like ice. Let's be realistic for once. You're an average student at best. You spend all your time hiding in your room or flipping burgers. You're community college material, Riley. Always have been, always will be. Stop living in a fantasy world and start contributing to this family. Madison stopped crying long enough to offer her signature smirk. Please, Riley. Even I wouldn't aim that high, and everyone knows I'm the smart one in this family. You should listen to Dad. The world needs people to serve coffee, too. My father then delivered the final blow. He told me that if I didn't comply, he would refuse to sign my financial aid forms. In the American system, without a parent's signature, I was essentially disqualified from receiving any aid. He thought he had checkmated me. He thought he had backed me into a corner where I had no choice but to surrender. I manufactured a look of absolute defeat, whispered, "Okay, you win," and walked upstairs. They didn't know I didn't need their signatures. I had already won the fellowship. For the next 3 months, I played the part of the broken, defeated daughter perfectly. I let my mother leave community college brochures on my bed. I listened to my father joke with his business partners on the phone about how I had finally come to my senses. I even let Madison brag about how my $10,000 was going toward her designer wedding shoes. I didn't actually give them the money yet. I told them it was in a high-yield certificate of deposit that wouldn't mature until January. It was a lie, but they were too arrogant to double-check. I spent my nights in my room, staring at the student portal for Stanford. I had submitted my independent predictive data modeling portfolio to the Vanguard Fellowship, a private program for exceptional independent researchers. It was completely decoupled from federal aid. It didn't require a father's signature or a mother's approval. It only required pure, undeniable talent. Living in that house during those 90 days was like breathing poison. Every meal was an exercise in psychological warfare. They wanted me to intimately understand that I was worth less than Madison. They wanted me to feel the weight of my mediocrity. I absorbed every insult, every snide remark, and every laugh. I worked extra shifts at the diner, not because I needed the money for tuition anymore, but because it gave me a reason to be out of that house. I was calculating the exact number of days until the winter decisions would be mailed out. The tension was building toward a breaking point, and that point arrived in the middle of January, on the exact night of my father's biggest event of the year. My father's 60th birthday wasn't just a party, it was a corporate networking event disguised as a celebration. My mother had spent months planning it, hiring an elite event firm to transform the entire first floor of our house. They brought in sleek modern furniture, towering white orchids, and a string quartet for the foyer. The dining room was turned into a lavish buffet with a raw oyster bar and prime rib station. The house was filled with 50 of the most influential people in my father's professional circle, CEOs, regional partners, and country club board members. My mother was in a state of manic frenzy, ensuring every detail broadcasted our family's immense wealth and flawless perfection. I, however, was not invited to be a guest. "Riley, you cannot just skulk around like a stray dog," my mother hissed at me in the kitchen. She shoved a silver tray of bacon-wrapped scallops into my hands. "You are a member of this family, so make yourself useful. Go circulate and serve the guests. And for heaven's sake, try to smile. You look like you're at a funeral." I didn't argue. I took the tray and stepped into the glittering, crowded living room. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, offering appetizers to people who didn't even look at my face. I was invisible to them, just a piece of the hired help in a plain black dress. From across the room, I saw Madison holding court in a silk dress that probably cost more than my car. She was clinging to Carter, laughing loudly at something a client said. She was bragging about her prestigious internship downtown, an internship my father had literally purchased for her to hide the fact that she was a college dropout. I stood there, holding a tray of scraps, and waited for the clock to strike 0. By 9 o'clock, the party had reached its absolute peak. The champagne was flowing, and the air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and ego. My father decided it was time to command the room. He stepped onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The room went silent. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice booming with the authority of a man who owned the world. He went into a long, narcissistic monologue about his legacy, his unyielding commitment to excellence, and his beautiful, brilliant family. He pointed to my mother, calling her his rock. Then he pointed to Madison and Carter, beaming with pride as he talked about Madison's bright future in marketing. He lied through his teeth about her academic achievements, painting a picture of a triumphant dynasty. He didn't mention my 10 a single time. I was standing 15 feet away from him, holding a tray of empty champagne flutes, completely erased from his narrative. To him, I was a failure he was trying to sweep under the rug. He raised his glass high. To the next decade of success, and to the unstoppable power of this family. The crowd cheered. Crystal clinked. My father was the king of the world. But right as the applause began to fade, the sharp, persistent ring of the front doorbell echoed through the foyer. A waiter hurried past the string quartet to open the heavy oak door. Standing there in the freezing Chicago wind was a courier in a thick winter jacket, clutching a digital signature pad and a rigid white envelope with purple and orange branding. It was a Fedex priority overnight package. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew exactly what was inside. The waiter signed for the package and, looking confused, handed it to my mother. She was annoyed. She ripped open the cardboard tab, expecting a late gift or a business document. She pulled out a heavy, cream-colored sheet of stationery. The crimson seal of Stanford University was embossed at the top. I watched from the kitchen island as the color drained from her face. Her hands began to shake so violently that the envelope slipped from her grasp and hit the marble with a soft thud. She let out a choked, breathless sound and backed away until she hit the refrigerator. My father, irritated that his moment of glory had been interrupted, pushed into the kitchen. "Caroline, what is the matter with you? You're making a scene," he snapped. He followed her trembling finger to the counter and snatched up the letter. He adjusted his glasses, ready to dismiss it. But as he read the first few lines, his arrogant posture physically dissolved. "What is this?" he muttered. He began to read aloud, and because the kitchen doors were propped open, his voice carried effortlessly into the silent living room where 50 guests were still watching. "Dear Riley, we are thrilled to offer you admission to Stanford University. Furthermore, you have been selected for the Vanguard Fellowship. This exclusive program covers full tuition, room and board, and provides a $20,000 annual research stipend for your work in predictive data modeling." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. 50 of the wealthiest, most influential people in our social circle had just witnessed the complete collapse of my father's lies. For the last hour, he had bragged about Madison while dismissing me as a troubled kid bound for community college. And now they all knew. They saw that the daughter he called worthless was actually a world-class prodigy. Madison pushed her way into the kitchen, her face contorted with jealousy. "No, this is a mistake. There's no way she got in. She's a BOI-bon. It has to be a clerical error." But the embossed seal and the specific mention of my software proved it was real. My father looked at me, and for the first time in my life, he looked small. The power dynamic flipped so violently it gave them whiplash. The guests began to leave almost immediately, forced smiles, hurried goodbyes, and awkward whispers. Nobody wanted to stay for the nuclear fallout. Within 30 minutes, the social event of the season was an empty, echoing mess. Once the last guest had closed the door, I thought maybe, just maybe, there would be a moment of pride. Or an apology. I was wrong. My father's shock mutated instantly back into toxic entitlement. He paced across the Persian rug, his face turning that familiar, violent purple. "Well," he said, his voice flat and commanding. "This is an unexpected development. But let's look at the logistics. Since your tuition and housing are now fully covered by this fellowship, you obviously don't need the $10,000 you saved. You will transfer those funds to Madison tomorrow morning so she can pay off her debt." I stared at him, genuinely stunned by the audacity. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, pointing a finger at me, that $20,000 stipend is far more than an 18-year-old needs. You will send Madison half of that every semester to help with her wedding expenses and her new apartment with Carter. It's the least you can do, considering you humiliated us tonight by keeping this a secret. He was dictating terms. He wanted to drain my success to fund Madison's failures. He expected me to nod, to shrink, and to hand over everything I had built. I looked at the man who had laughed at my dreams. I looked at the mother who had thrown my achievements in the trash. I looked at the sister who told me I was born to serve. "No," I said. It was the last time I would ever say it to them. "I am not giving her my savings. I am not giving her a penny of my stipend." You laughed at me. You tried to sabotage me. And now you want the reward I earned entirely without you? Absolutely not. My father roared. He took a threatening step toward me. "You ungrateful brat. If you walk out that door, you are cut off forever. You will have no home to come back to. You will be entirely on your own." I grabbed the Fedex envelope and my winter coat. I looked back at them one last time, the breathing monster that was my father, the weeping shell of my mother, and the hateful eyes of my sister. "I've been on my own for 18 years, I whispered. "Being cut off from you isn't a punishment. It's a rescue mission." I walked out into the freezing night, and for the first time in my life, I could actually breathe. Walking onto the campus of Stanford University in Palo Alto was the most terrifying and exhilarating moment of my life. I arrived with 2 battered suitcases, my refurbished laptop, and a bank account containing exactly $10,000 that I had fought like hell to protect. The California sun was a stark contrast to the freezing, gray slush of Chicago, but the internal transition was even more jarring. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible disappointment. But I quickly realized that being a big fish in a small pond in Chicago meant nothing in the shark tank of Silicon Valley. I was surrounded by the literal brightest minds on the planet. My roommates were the children of diplomats and tech billionaires. They spent their weekends at Lake Tahoe or flying to Napa Valley. I spent my weekends in the basement of the computer science building, surviving on vending machine protein bars and stale coffee. The Vanguard Fellowship covered my tuition and housing, but the $20,000 annual stipend had to be stretched thin. I lived like a monk. I didn't go to the parties. I didn't join the exclusive social clubs. I wore the same 3 pairs of jeans and 5 black t-shirts every single day. The trauma of my childhood had left me with a permanent sense of scarcity. Even with money in the bank, I was constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. I felt like an imposter. I kept expecting a campus security guard to tap me on the shoulder and tell me there had been a mistake, that the community college girl didn't belong here. I channeled that fear into my work. I didn't just study, I obsessed. I took 18 units a semester. I spent my nights staring at lines of code until my eyes bled. I realized that if I wanted to be truly free, truly untouchable, I didn't just need a degree. I needed an empire. I began looking at my predictive models not just as an academic exercise, but as a weapon. I wanted to build something that would make my father's marketing agency look like a lemonade stand. I wasn't just working for an A+, I was working for the day I would never have to hear his laughter again. By my sophomore year, I had pivoted my research toward supply chain risk management. I noticed that while the world was becoming increasingly globalized, the systems predicting logistics failures were archaic. I developed a proprietary algorithm that used microeconomic shifts, things like local weather patterns, labor strike whispers, and fuel price volatility, to predict supply chain bottlenecks weeks before they happened. I called it Sentinel Logic. I launched the company from my dorm room during my junior year. I operated under an anonymous LLC because I didn't want my name anywhere near it. I was 20 years old, taking advanced multivariable calculus by day and pitching my software to regional shipping firms by night. The initial rejections were brutal. I was a young woman in a field dominated by 50-year-old men in expensive suits. They looked at me the same way my father did, with a mix of amusement and condescension. They didn't think I had the stature to handle their data. But the logic was undeniable. I offered a 3-month free trial to a mid-sized logistics firm in Oakland. Within 60 days, Sentinel Logic had saved them over $400,000 by rerouting their shipments 48 hours before a major port strike occurred. Suddenly, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. I was working 100 hours a week. I would be in the middle of a lecture on artificial intelligence, quietly responding to high-stakes emails from corporate attorneys. I graduated a full semester early. While my peers were planning their post-grad backpacking trips through Europe, I was hiring my first team of 5 developers and moving into a tiny, cramped office in San Francisco. I still didn't have a social life. I still didn't have a boyfriend. I had a mission. I watched the numbers in my business account grow from $10,000 to $100,000, then to $500,000. Every dollar felt like a brick in a wall I was building between me and the North Shore of Chicago. I was becoming the person my father always feared I would be, someone he couldn't control. The ultimate payoff arrived on a Tuesday afternoon just after my 20th birthday. A global tech conglomerate, the kind of company that has its logo on half the buildings in San Jose, offered to acquire Sentinel Logic. The negotiations lasted 6 weeks. My attorneys were ruthless, and so was I. When the final contracts were signed, the acquisition price was set. After taxes and payouts to my small team, the amount hitting my personal account was $15 million. I remember sitting in my office, staring at the screen of my laptop, the expensive, high-powered one that had replaced my old refurbished Dell. I watched the refresh button. When the wire transfer cleared, and I saw that 8-figure balance, I didn't jump for joy. I didn't pop champagne. I actually sat there and cried. It was a strange, hollow kind of grief. I realized that I had achieved the absolute pinnacle of success, and I had nobody to call. I couldn't call my mother to tell her I was a multimillionaire. I couldn't call my father to tell him that his average daughter had just made more money in a single afternoon than he had made in the last decade. I was entirely, fundamentally alone in my victory. I spent the next year traveling, but the stillness drove me crazy. I realized that I didn't want to retire. I wanted to play the game on a much larger scale. I took a significant portion of my capital and founded a boutique venture capital firm called Vesper Holdings. I specialized in distressed assets, companies that had good ideas but were failing because of terrible management. I became known in the industry as a fixer. I would buy a struggling company, fire the incompetent executives, restructure the debt, and turn it into a profit machine. I was 28 years old, living in a penthouse overlooking the San Francisco Bay, and I was completely, utterly untouchable. I had erased the ghost of Riley from Chicago and replaced her with a woman who held the power of life and death over the dreams of men who looked exactly like Harrison. Even though I had blocked my family's emails and changed my number years ago, I still kept a quiet eye on them. It wasn't about missing them. It was about intelligence. In business, you always monitor the competition, and in my mind, the Harrison family was the ultimate competitor. The rumors began to reach me through old high school acquaintances and business news in the Midwest. It turned out that the golden child narrative was expensive to maintain. Harrison had gone into massive debt to finance Madison's lavish wedding to Carter. The wedding had cost nearly $300,000, featuring imported flowers and a 5-tier cake that probably cost more than my first car. But the marriage was a disaster from the start. Carter's family car dealerships were hit hard by a series of lawsuits and a shift in the market. He wasn't the young mogul my father thought he was. He was a trust fund baby whose trust fund was running dry. But the real collapse was Apex Marketing. My father's agency had failed to adapt to the digital age. He was still trying to sell old-school billboards and expensive television spots in a world dominated by AI-driven social media. He had mismanaged his payroll, and according to the industry chatter, he had lost his 3 largest clients in a single quarter. The final blow came when Madison was appointed vice president of operations at the firm. Harrison, desperate to keep the perfect family image alive, had tried to groom her to take over. It was a catastrophe. Madison had no work ethic, no understanding of logistics, and a habit of treating the staff like her personal servants. The client retention rate plummeted by 60% in just 3 years. They were drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, and the bank was preparing to foreclose on their North Shore mansion. They were desperate. They were broken. And they started looking for a Hail Mary investment from a faceless, venture capital firm in San Francisco that had been making waves in the distressed asset market. They had no idea that the faceless investor was the girl they had laughed at over a mahogany table 10 years ago. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in late October. Exactly 10 years to the month since that infamous family meeting. I was sitting in my corner office, sipping an espresso and watching the rain lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows. My executive assistant, Evelyn, buzzed my intercom. "Your 10 o'clock pitch meeting is here, Riley," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "The founders from Apex Marketing. They're in the main glass boardroom." I took a slow, steadying breath. I smoothed down the fabric of my tailored $2,000 blazer. I checked my reflection in the glass. I didn't look like a ghost anymore. I looked like a shark. I picked up the thick, black folder containing the catastrophic financial audit of their company and walked toward the boardroom. The boardroom was a masterpiece of modern architecture, nothing but glass and steel, suspended over the city. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors, they moved silently. Harrison and Madison were sitting on the far side of the massive mahogany table. Their backs were to the windows, framed by the gray San Francisco skyline. They didn't look up immediately. Harrison was frantically checking his luxury watch, which I noticed was an older model, likely one of the few assets he hadn't sold yet. Madison was nervously organizing a stack of glossy pitch decks, her hands trembling. She looked tired. The golden child shimmer had faded, replaced by the weary look of someone who had realized that beauty couldn't pay a mortgage. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They looked exactly like the kind of people I usually rejected within the first 5 minutes of a meeting. "Good morning," I said, my voice perfectly level. Harrison looked up first. He had his CEO smile, ready, the manipulative, charming grin he used to sell lies to clients. But the second his eyes locked onto mine, that smile didn't just fade, it physically collapsed. He went rigid. He blinked rapidly, his brain clearly struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the invisible girl he had bullied a decade ago. Madison looked up a second later and literally gasped, dropping her pitch deck. The papers scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. "Riley?" Harrison whispered. His voice was cracked, stripped of all its boardroom authority. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. What are you doing here?" I walked to the head of the table and stood there. I didn't sit down. Standing is a power move, and I wanted them to feel every inch of the height I had gained since I left Chicago. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vesper Holdings, I said calmly. You are in my building. You are drinking my coffee. And according to your application, you're here to beg me for a $2 million investment to save your bankrupt agency. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the rain hitting the glass. I watched Harrison's mind desperately trying to pivot. He was a predator, and a predator's first instinct when caught is to play nice. He forced a sickeningly sweet smile onto his face and actually stood up, opening his arms as if he were about to pull me into a hug. Riley. Sweetheart, he exclaimed, his voice dripping with fake, desperate affection. This is incredible. We've been looking for you for years. Your mother is going to be so thrilled. To think my own daughter built all this. I always knew you had this in you. We are so incredibly proud of you. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him with a look of clinical detachment. Do not stand in my office and pretend you ever believed in me, Harrison, I said softly. You laughed until you cried when I told you my dreams. You refused to sign my financial aid forms to try and force me into a life of service. You demanded I hand over my savings to fund your golden child's failures. His smile faltered, but he was too desperate to give up. He sat back down, his posture shrinking. Riley, please. That was 10 years ago. I made a mistake. I was stressed. But we're family. Blood is thicker than water. Apex Marketing is underwater. We have hundreds of employees relying on us. If we don't get this $2 million by Friday, the bank is going to foreclose on everything. We'll lose the house. We'll lose our legacy. We'll be ruined. I turned my gaze to Madison. She was shaking, unable to meet my eyes. And what about you, Madison? What is your role in this disaster? I'm the vice president of operations, she mumbled. I picked up the audit folder and flipped through it casually. According to my data, your operating expenses are bloated by 40%. You've mismanaged $3 million in payroll. You've spent more on corporate lunches and first-class travel than you've made in profit. This isn't a company, Harrison. It's a vanity project that's run out of fuel. Harrison leaned across the table, his eyes pleading. We can turn it around, Riley. We just need an injection of capital. We need a partner who understands the business. We need you. Please, for your mother. For the family name. He slid the thick, glossy pitch deck across the table until it rested right in front of me. I looked down at it for a moment. Then, I looked directly into his eyes, the eyes that had once looked at my Stanford acceptance letter with nothing but contempt. I placed my hand on the binder and slowly slid it right back across the table to him. I felt a surge of cold, clean peace wash over me. You want a $2 million valuation for a company with zero client retention and negative equity? I said, perfectly mirroring the exact mocking tone he had used at the dining room table 10 years ago. That's rich, Harrison. That is the funniest thing I've heard all week. Harrison physically recoiled, as if I had struck him. He recognized the words instantly. He looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. I turned my attention to Madison, offering her the same cold, condescending smirk she had given me my entire life. $2 million for a failing agency run by a college dropout? Even I wouldn't aim that high, Madison. And everybody knows I'm the smart one in this family. Madison burst into tears. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, not the performative, pretty tears she used to get her way, but the ugly, jagged sobs of someone who realized her safety net had been shredded. I reached over to the silver intercom panel on the table and pressed the button. Evelyn, I said clearly, please have the security team come up to the boardroom. The founders of Apex Marketing are finished with their pitch, and they need to be escorted out of the building immediately. Harrison stood up, his hands shaking violently. You're really going to do this? You're going to watch your own father lose everything. You're not my father, I replied, my voice devoid of any anger. I was just stating a fact. You're a bad investment. Have a safe flight back to Chicago, Harrison. I hear the winters are particularly brutal this year. I turned my back on them and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't look back to see them being led away by security. I walked into my office, closed the door, and sat in the silence. The heavy, invisible chain I had been dragging since I was 5 years old was finally, permanently gone. 3 weeks after that meeting, Apex Marketing officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The North Shore mansion was sold at auction. My father was forced into a humiliating, broke retirement, and Madison ended up taking a minimum-wage retail job at a mall just to help them pay for groceries in their small, two-bedroom apartment. They got exactly the life they had tried to force onto me. And I got the life I built with my own 2 hands. I learned that boundaries aren't about revenge. They're about self-respect. You don't owe toxic people your success just because you share a last name. My worth was never determined by their mockery. It was determined by the life I chose to build after I walked away. So, I have a question for you all. After their company completely went under, my mother Caroline sent me a long, tearful email begging for a relationship, saying she was forced to go along with my dad's cruelty just to keep the peace. She says she's old, sick, and just wants to see her daughter one last time before it's too late. Part of me feels a tiny twinge of guilt, but the rest of me knows she sat by and watched me be destroyed for 18 years without saying a word. Am I the asshole for completely icing my mother out, or should I give her one single chance to explain herself? Thank you so much for listening to my journey. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to find your own worth after being counted out, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share these stories with the people who need to hear them most. I'll be in the comments reading your verdicts. Take care of yourselves out there.